Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Substack, our latest conversation this week with Raheem Kassan, who some of you will know, some of you may not know, but I've known Raheem for, let me think, crikey, over a decade. And the reason I wanted to have him on the Substack was twofold. Firstly, Raheem advised closely Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party during the mid-2010s when the party was really experiencing its breakthrough period. And I think it's fair to say that Raheem has remained a point of advice and counsel for people in and around the Reform Party ever since. Albeit not formally. But secondly, since moving to the United States of America, Raheem has played a very active role in shaping the MAGA movement, both in terms of being one of the first people to see it coming, working closely with Steve Bannon, among others, but also really becoming a communicator and an interpreter of the MAGA movement through the National Pulse, which Raheem edits, and more recently through his extensive social networking in the Washington scene in America, with the being co-owner of the Butterworths Club, which is already a notorious hangout for MAGA and indeed some non-MAGA people. I believe Peter Mandelson, among others, has been spotted at this venue. But getting to the reason why I wanted you all to meet Raheem and actually for us to have this conversation with him is I actually struggle to think of anybody who can bridge the Trump-Farage worlds in the way that Raheem can. And so the questions we want to get into today are questions like, if the polls are right, we've had another bombshell poll this week suggesting Reform are going to win a pretty comprehensive majority at the next election. We've had another MRP poll. So if Nigel Farage is going to be the next Prime Minister, how does he ensure that that Reform government looks a lot more like Trump 2 than Trump 1? By all accounts, Trump 1 was not as effective as the current administration is certainly being. Also, how does Raheem think the Reform movement needs to evolve and campaign in order to achieve power and hold power, given his proximity to the party in the mid-2010s? And I think more generally, there's going to be a lot of interest both in the UK and the US. We have readers in America, we have readers in Britain, we have readers in 180 countries. But there's going to be a lot of interest as well in, I think, your assessment around where we are going with the anti-establishment, some might say populist movement, but certainly patriotic sovereignty movement that is focused on representing the forgotten majority. Are we reaching peak populism, or is this just beginning of a long-term reconfiguration? So firstly, welcome to Sachs. Great to have you finally for this conversation. The last time we met up, I think, was during the inauguration weekend back in January. It's been personally, it's been great to watch your rise in America from afar and wonder why on earth I'm still in Keir Starmer's Britain and didn't make the move myself. But that's by the side. So give us your initial reactions, firstly, to what you're seeing. Firstly, from a distance with Reform and Nigel Farage, and how you think things have changed since you were directly advising the party in 2015.
Hey guys, let's be honest, what often passes for journalism today is little more than politically charged activism with a headline that's slapped on top. The truth gets buried under layers and layers of spin, agenda, and those algorithm-driven narratives, which is why I turn to Ground News. It cuts straight through all of that noise, and it shows you what's really going on. Ground News brings together headlines from about 50,000 sources across the globe. But what really makes it powerful is the transparency. You don't just see the stories, you actually see the political bias behind every source, the ownership ties, because let's be honest, we know that money influences coverage, and exactly how each side is covering the news. Have a look for yourself at ground.news/Goodwin Take Britain's new strategic defence review, for example. The government just announced plans for up to 12 new attack submarines and a £15 billion fund for nuclear warheads. Over 300 sources have covered this story, 32% from the left, 28% from the right, and 40% in the centre. But when we compare the headlines ourselves, we can see that The Independent focuses on how Labour pledged this massive defence boost under pressure from Donald Trump. Meanwhile, right-wing news framed this plan as putting the UK on a war footing to counter the immediate threat from Russia. Same story, but completely different angles. Now, my favourite feature is the blind spot feed, which surfaces stories that are ignored by the other side, like the fact that 4 in 10 babies born in Britain today have foreign-born parents. That story, well, it was covered 100% by the right, but not a single outlet in the centre or on the left reported it. So if you're tired of being pushed into these echo chambers and you want to actually understand what is going on, Ground News is a tool for you. Head over to ground.news/Goodwin, click the link in my description, or scan the QR code to get 40% off their Unlimited Vantage plan, which is the same one I use myself. More than 1 million people have already downloaded Ground News. If you care about seeing the full picture, you should be one of them. Check it out.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me. And to your audience, especially those who don't know me, it's very funny that you mentioned that, because it happens quite a lot now. We get a lot of Brits coming over to Washington, D.C., especially younger ones trying to get involved in the US, trying to get some work experience here, and they'll walk into Butterworth's, as you say, and I'll sort of be standing at the bar, and they'll come up to me and go, I think I know you from somewhere, and I sort of don't know whether to be offended or happy at the fact that, I'm no longer recognizable from Keir Starmer's Britain. Once upon a time, I couldn't walk down the street in Westminster or Victoria without some cab driver shouting at me a reference from one of my infamous Sky News interviews or something. And so, it's been a long time. It's been about a decade, as you say, since we were all running around with Nigel, in proximity with him, when UKIP, the UK Independence Party, was really, now it feels like so much longer, right? But then again, I guess the inauguration doesn't feel like it was only in January this year. It was David Cameron back then, and David Cameron was the target of the anti-establishment ire. We spent just nights long in the UKIP office in London, figuring out, attack lines and all of this stuff. And by and large, at the time, I sort of thought to myself, and I wonder how you feel about this, Matt, that actually so much of that landed in our laps. The number of unforced errors by the Conservative Party at the time was such that we only had to not make errors ourselves, and we found ourselves in the ascendancy. Now, I think some of that remains true today, certainly when you look at the interchangeability. And I realise that there are for some reason, Robert Jenrick fans out there, and I realise there are still some Tory stalwarts out there. But I still think of the Labour and the Conservative Party as interchangeable, and a couple of points off the tax rate doesn't make for a healthy party system. Some of that remains true, but some is actually very, very different. Some we've gone from watching somebody like Nigel Farage be a more kind of latent ascendant figure, simply as, what they called us back in the day, a protest vote, to being an out-and-out leader. And that kind of dovetails with what you're saying about the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, is that actually, back in 2016, there was a lack of personnel, there was a lack of preparation, there was a lack of understanding about how government worked. There were all these things that required thought and moral and political leadership that sort of we didn't quite get to rise to that occasion. And this time around, as I say, the inauguration was only really, 7 odd months ago, and it feels like it's already been about 7 years. So they've clearly learned something along the way.
What do you think, knowing Nigel Farage and that movement as well as you do, what do you think they've taken from watching Trump? Because Trump 1, in my mind, was very much, Trump goes to war with the deep state, and arguably, to some extent, the state was quite effective at slowing him down, and, he, I think by all accounts, struggled to fill some of the key appointments with loyalists. A lot of people were, pretty openly hostile to him. I'm working on the assumption exactly the same is now going to happen to a reform or a reform-led government. If indeed that happens, that basically the civil service, the UK state, will essentially go to war with that movement, will do everything it can to block Prime Minister Farage. You will have civil servants refusing to work. You'll have civil servants going on strike. You will have the blob, broadly defined, doing everything it can to slow down the mission. And so I have no doubt that Nigel Farage will have been talking to senior Republicans and MAGA influencers like yourself. So what do you think is the lesson there that can be transferred into UK politics when it comes to navigating the state? Because I think the state is the first order problem. Mass immigration, broken borders, these are second order problems. The first order problem is basically the elite class that has been governing Western nations for the last 30 years. And, reforming that class, gutting that class, replacing it with a more representative class that actually cares about the country is the first order of business.
Yeah, and if I might just distance myself a little bit from being sort of labeled a MAGA influencer, because I think I'm quite critical when the movement needs it and when President Trump needs it. And the New York Times asked me, sort of said the same thing to me during the campaign and said, well, how would you describe yourself? And I sort of just, the first word that came to my head was, I'm the ref. I'm the ombudsman. I'm the sort of one who when the campaign was spending too much money on high consulting fees during the campaign last year, I was the one on the political right who called it out. In fact, not a lot of people know this, I was actually banned from one of the Trump rallies during that because the staff around him was so upset that I might have said something about it. They tried to cut me out of one of the rallies. It didn't work in the long run, of course. And, I maintain friendships at the very highest levels in the White House today. And let me tell you something, the difference in caliber. Look, when they were coming into power in 2016, they didn't have a quote-unquote Project 2025, which was, the Heritage Foundation, this think tank on Capitol Hill. They put together this sort of plan and personnel database of who could hit the ground running and what the policy should be hitting the ground running. Now, the policy element of that came under massive fire in the media. Oh, it's far right, it's fascist, it's authoritarian, all the usual things, right? All the critiques that the political right is now used to and rolls off like water off a duck's back. But the secret weapon was the personnel database. And when you look at the types of people who are now staffing up the Trump administration versus the types who were doing it in 2016, well, nothing against those people from 2016, but they were on a giant, steep Sisyphean learning curve. And every time they felt like they were advancing the ball some way down the pitch, a cavalcade of deep state apparatus came, down on them like a ton of bricks. Not just the Russia hoax and all of the things that we know about that to be untrue, but you've got to remember, there were people inside the Trump administration who were actively leaking stuff to the press. There was the anonymous author who wrote the op-ed, I think, wherever it was, the New York Times or Washington Post or something, saying, I work inside the Trump administration at one of the highest levels, and I am trying to stymie him at every opportunity. This is exactly the sort of thing that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party can expect if they were to take government in the UK. And it's funny, I don't think I'm betraying any trust when I say this. Is the first thing that I said to Nigel when he came into Butterworth's a couple of months ago. I said, listen, everything else aside, you're doing fantastic on a broad, cross-section of measures. But the one thing that you really, really must have, under your belt is a plan to deal with the deep state, and because, listen, the deep state in the United Kingdom is far more entrenched and has far more tricks up its sleeve than Hillary Clinton and her apparatchiks here in Washington, D.C. I mean, in a lot of senses, Matt, they were flying by the seat of their pants at the same time, which is why the whole Russia stuff really never came to anything. It's all kind of unraveled.
Well,
just go ahead.
Just briefly on that, if I could, I think you're absolutely on the money there, because the other thing that, let's say, a Prime Minister Farage is going to have is much less room for manoeuvre when it comes to political appointments. President Trump is appointing 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people across the federal bureaucracy. He's got enormous power at his disposal as president. A Prime Minister Farage is going to be really making, what, 100 or so special advisor appointments. His room for maneuver is going to be limited. The House of Lords, the Lords are going to do everything for the first 2 years to basically block the agenda of a reform government. And I was talking to a constitutional expert here in the UK actually earlier on today over lunch about this, and this person was saying, look, for the first 2 years of a reform government, almost nothing will be getting done because the Lords will just reject pretty much everything that comes forward. Now, unless, for example, Prime Minister Farage can appoint, 700, 800 peers and try and overcome it that way, or whether he decides, okay, I'm going to wait, a bit like Thatcher, I'm going to do all this stuff at the end of my administration. Don't know. But you're right in the sense that the constitutional makeup of the UK is designed in such a way that it's going to. There are multiple barriers to insurgents, and also we've given a lot of power away. I mean, we've given power to the European Convention on Human Rights. We've given powers to the quangocracy. We've given powers to the expert committees. We've given powers to the public bodies. This is all a legacy of the Blairite revolution, the dispersal of power. So, when people say prime ministers pull levers in number 10 and then, nothing happens, the system has become so convoluted and complex that there is a question mark over, well, how much is Sir Prime Minister Farage going to be able to do in the early weeks, months and years?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that the devolution argument is really important because in the United States, it's not just presidential elections that has people putting up yard signs, in their front gardens. There are some outside. I'm looking out the window here on Capitol Hill now, and there are some for sort of the local ward commissioner and things like that. For the public watching this in the United Kingdom, especially to understand is that they are going to have to get involved at a very, very grassroots level and a very frequent level to keep that train on the tracks. Otherwise, it will get derailed by wherever power has been vested. The people that it's been vested in will desperately try and cling on to it. And that can apply to a local mayor, that can apply to a police and crime commissioner. It will especially apply to your local NHS authority. All of these things that will require root and branch reform, these people are going to cling on because like their life depends on it, because their life depends on it, right?
Yeah.
They have built a livelihood, they have built monopolies of power in that regard. The other thing that, to address your first question, just again very quickly, that stands out to me that from Trump 1 to Trump 2 that I think bears consideration is coalition building. And perhaps it's a topic we'll come on to later on in the discussion, but I note a lot of the critiques, especially from the very online right, about Farage and about reform. But if you look, I like to remind people, if you look at what President Trump did to win this last election, remember, he went to a Muslim-dominated neighborhood in Hamtramck in Michigan and got the Gaza-obsessive local mayor and local councillors to endorse Donald Trump. There are such things as coalitions of the willing. There are also such things as coalitions of the unwilling. And I suspect that in the run-up to the next election, we're presuming a lot in this conversation, right? It's a lot of hypotheticals.
Sure.
But on the run-up to the next election, whether people like it or not, Farage is going to have to put together a coalition of the unwilling as well as the willing.
Okay, so let me just pin you on that because I think your insight will be invaluable. You know the ecosystem of the right intimately. You've written a couple of books, No-Go Zones and the provocatively titled Enoch Was Right. You know the right intimately. What do you think when you see people in the UK online sphere saying Farage isn't serious about deportations, reform is a containment strategy for the establishment, it's not radical enough, it's appointed prominent Muslims to positions of power? I mean, in all seriousness, knowing what Trump has done in the US, knowing what the MAGA movement has done, having worked closely with Farage, with the UK, having seen it all, what is your take on this, noisy debate that we are having?
It's probably my favorite conversation right now, especially a conversation that happens a lot at the bar. Nigel himself taught me the phrase "every pub's a parliament," and we've really tried to inculcate that here on Capitol Hill. And whether it's Brits who come over or people who consume the news from the online right in the UK and just sort of regurgitate it, I love to have this conversation because I always start with, look, you're never gonna convince somebody who left Islam under threat, me, that Nigel is somehow going soft on Islam. You're never gonna convince me that Zia, gosh, I can't remember his name now.
Yusuf.
Yeah, is a radical Muslim, and you're also never going to convince me as somebody who watched. I remember I was a kid when Nigel Farage was coming up, and who watched this man's trajectory taking on every single facet, every single argument that the establishment tried to tamp down on, especially immigration. That somehow he's now going soft on it. It's a nonsense, and it's a nonsense from people that we've seen time and time again. I don't really want to get into the business of naming names here, but Matt,
Sure.
over the course of the last 10, 15 years, we've seen people come up and they look at what Nigel does and they look at what the UKIP leadership does and they go, I can do better than that. And they make a run at him, right? Instead of starting their own thing and building from scratch, they want to make a run at him and take on what he's done as their own. I have a lot of sympathy for them as somebody who sort of saw what Nigel did close up, and at one point myself thought, yeah, I might have a pop at that. It's probably the single most difficult thing that I've ever seen anybody do. There are two things. There's one thing in particular that unites characters like Donald Trump and like Nigel Farage, and that is stamina. This man, I mean, these two men, when you think about what Trump's done alone in the last week, you might not agree with it, you might not be a Trump fan, but between going to Alaska and hosting Putin and hosting all these European leaders and Zelensky and doing the trade deals and doing the criminal stuff that's cleaning up Washington, D.C. right now, and all of these other things that are going on, it takes a level of stamina and it takes a level of leadership and it takes a level of focus, right? And these two men have those things in common.
Well, especially when you're in your 60s and your 80s. I mean, Nigel Farage, I think 61. Trump is into his 80s now.
It's unbelievable. And even I was watching one of these very, very left-wing CNN news anchors the other day talking about Trump, and believe me, he's not a fan of him. Jake Tapper, they are at loggerheads all of the time. For those who know him, you'll know what I'm talking about. And even Jake Tapper said, Trump has this mysterious energy source that nobody really understands where he gets it, where it comes from, but he's got it and we have to deal with it. And that's the same sort of thing you have with Farage, is I've watched him up close and personal, running through streets as polls are closing, trying to get every single vote out, going through day after day of campaigning, hosting rallies, doing constituency meetings. Remember, he's not just the MP for Clacton, he was the MEP for the southeast of England for over a decade. This man, fully understands the democratic process, is fully committed to the democratic process. And for all these critics out there, I just wish that they had to live a week in his shoes, because trust me, I had to try and do it to keep up with him when I was working for him. It's almost impossible. You know it. You follow him around. You know it. It is almost impossible.
It is remarkable, especially, I come into contact with Nigel regularly through GB News, and what you have to understand, I do point this out to people, most television presenters have one job, which is to present television, right? That's what they do. They have all day to prepare for their show. They all day to prepare to have a nice rest if they want it. The one thing about Farage is, what people have to remember is, he's doing his show after a full day of being a member of parliament, being a political party leader, being an influencer, being a broadcaster, and then coming on and doing this show. So I say, there's someone in early 40s. It is, the stamina is remarkable. But the other thing I do think, and this is where I found the debate slightly losing track with political reality. Let's put it like that. Like, whatever you think about the ins and the outs of particular policies, the one thing about Farage that I always remind people of is his place in history. Now, I genuinely think he is a modern day Wat Tyler, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt who marched on London. And he's consistently been underestimated by his critics. There is only one person in this country that has won two nationwide elections with two different parties, and that was Farage. He won the European elections with UKIP and the Brexit Party. He is the only person to lead a political party that has finished above the two big parties at local elections, which he did earlier this year, winning the local elections with Reform pretty comfortably, I might add. He's fundamentally, as you say, transformed the debate in this country over Brexit, which in the early 90s was a pretty fringe issue on the Eurosceptic margins, and he turned that into a mainstream issue, and he's done the same with mass migration. And so it's difficult to think of a figure, maybe Tony Blair would be another one, who has been as transformative for British politics. In fact, my colleague and friend Vernon Bogdanor has just finished a book on, I think, 6 people who never made it as Prime Minister, but who Vernon Bogdanor considers to be among the most influential politicians. And of course, there's a chapter for Farage simply because of the impact he's had on the debate. So I do think his critics are underestimating him as well. But let me just come back to this point about a reform government, because I remember back in the day, not long ago, many of Farage's critics, I won't name names, okay, Dominic Cummings, among others, said that Nigel Farage would never be able to get over 15% of the national vote. And this was an argument that was running at the time of Brexit. Douglas Carswell, Daniel Hannan, Dominic Cummings, let's say the Tory
Tim
right.
Montgomery.
Tim Montgomery, who's now in Reform. They were all saying, look, this guy's toxic. Okay, well, now today he's on 31%. So again, underestimating him. But now voters are looking at him differently. They're like, okay, you're not just a rabble-rouser, you're not just a protest guy, you're actually potentially Prime Minister. Which leads to my question, how does he manage the people around him now? Because he's going to have to find, 600 odd candidates. And I'm just going to be very honest and direct. These people are going to have to be competent. They're going to have to be smart. They're going to have to be able to navigate the political system, because the state is going to come down on them like a ton of bricks. They're ideally going to have some parliamentary experience. And I just wonder how you think he's going to navigate that issue of taking an outsider movement and transforming it into an insider party of government.
Yeah, it's a great question, because it comes back to what we're seeing here in the US as well, and it comes down to experience. I can look, the elephant in the room when it comes to a lot of this stuff, for some reason, appears to be Tommy Robinson, who is a friend of mine and I've known for many years, and I have some sympathies towards his persecution, and I have some non-sympathies for some other things that go on in his life, right? And a lot of this critique online seems to sort of revolve around that, and Nigel's dealing with that, and Nigel's previous dealing with the British National Party, and so on and so forth, as if, again, I stress this, that a man who has led his entire life banging the drum on mass migration and banging the drum on getting Britain out of the EU and getting parliamentary sovereignty back is suddenly going to change and is suddenly going to cave. Listen, Nigel Farage, the very same way as Donald Trump, could have had a very cushy retirement by now. Could be in broadcasting, could be here in America doing his thing. He's extremely popular over here. Could be a Fox News host, quite frankly, over here if he wanted to be. But he has chosen, unlike some of us actually, and I'll wear my lumps for this, because people always say to me, "Well, you left, you fled to Washington D.C." as if it's easier here, by the way. But he chose to stay there and to fight and to keep fighting, and for certain people to bring up, okay, this one person that they've brought over as a parliamentary candidate, whatever, has some more liberal view about transgenderism in prisons or whatever it is. Need I remind them that Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State. This is a person that Trump dismissed as Little Marco back in 2016. It's somebody who was reviled amongst the MAGA base for so very long. In fact, I said it to him the other day. It was the 4th of July party at the State Department. I found myself at the bar next to Marco Rubio. We've met a couple of times. He's been in the restaurant. So I felt very comfortable saying to him, I said, I hope you don't mind me saying, Mr. Secretary of State. But there was a time when you would have walked into a place like Butterworth's and you would have been booed and hissed at, and maybe somebody would have thrown a drink on you. But actually now people all want to buy you a drink. What I'm trying to say with that is, the force of personality and the force of policy that emanates from somebody like Donald Trump. Nigel has that very same thing. So to say that one person on your team has a different opinion and that means somehow the party's selling out, or some backbencher says something different that you disagree with, and therefore it means the party is selling out, is a nonsense. You wouldn't hold Donald Trump or the GOP apparatus responsible for what some congressman from Alabama said on the House floor. And people need to have the same instincts when they hear a plethora of voices inside reform. Listen, I was known as Mr. Far Right. If you ask, the mainstream political reporters, the news anchors, especially if you ask, Gamal Fanbullah on Sky News many years ago, I was the person, the untouchable. Don't have him on air. He's a nut job, etc., etc. And so for me, to hear these arguments from people saying, "Oh no, they're going to sell out, they're going to change," it's nonsense. To answer your question, if you have the strength of personality and the strength of policy that's in the middle, and if Nigel sticks to his guns on those things, then actually that radiates outwards and it impacts everybody around him. They take their lead from him. Populism, a lot of people think it's just about following. But it's an old quote from Shimon Peres, I think. He said, public opinion's like perfume. The point is to smell it. The point is not to drink it. Public opinion is put through a filter. That filter is parliamentary democracy. If we don't like that, then we can have a different conversation. But right now, that's how policy is made. And I think when you look at bringing more serious voices to the table, and more experienced voices to the table, there is such a lesson to be learned from this Trump administration.
Yeah,
and not
sure.
just people who agreed with Trump all along, by the way, not just headbangers, Project 2024.
I guess the one thing I would say, partly in response to that though, is Trump came through the Republican movement, which historically, has made a lot of mistakes, obviously, forever wars, globalism, migration. But you have had organizations like the NRA, among others, that have tried to, and have successfully, given it some sense of coherence and discipline. Now, when, for example, in the UK, we saw, I don't want to name names, but there have been people who have joined Reform recently from the Conservatives who are fanatically supportive of net zero, who only a year ago were telling people the answer to Britain's problems is somebody like Tom Tugendhat, sort of liberal one nation Tory. There are people who sit back, even Tim Montgomery, for example. Lots of people were like, this is an interesting appointment. What's going on here? And I'd be very candid with you. I actually said to Nigel Farage at the time, I said, look, interesting appointment. And his response, I think, was quite revealing. And, I don't think he'd mind me at all saying it. I think he said, I've always valued free spirits. I value people who, he's not looking for stooges, right? He's not looking for people that will agree with him the whole time. He's looking for people that sort of personify that sense of freedom and liberty. And I think that's, part of the story there. But what is your line or your view on how we should manage defections? Because if the polling stays as it is, Reform is going to be flooded with Conservative MPs, Conservative activists, who basically are going to look at Reform as a reason to get seats in the Commons, right? They're not going to be true believers. They're going to be careerists. And listening to you, it sounds as though what you're saying is, well, every governing party is going to have to take a cluster of those people. But I guess I would respond by saying, okay, but then how does Farageism remain coherent? How does it stop being infiltrated or taken over by liberal Tories who have basically destroyed the country. I mean, that, my view, is liberal Tories are indistinguishable from Labour, basically, on all of the big issues of the day. So how do you preserve and protect a movement from being hijacked?
Yeah, you won't find any disagreement with me on any of that. What I will say is that you have to thread the needle very carefully. Now, firstly, you maintain a power base, right, inside. You have to have your most loyal people. Trump has his most loyal people around him. And that creates, listen, I went through this, right, when in 2015, there were plenty of pot shots at the leadership, at Nigel himself, from within the party. We were his phalanx. Our job was to take the arrows, to take the bullets, and at one point, as you remember, ultimately to take the fall. After the 2015 election, there was a move against Nigel as leader inside, and I remember having a conversation with him. I was still employed by the party at the time, and he said to me, "Listen, man, they're coming after me. They're coming after you. I think if we give them you, we'll survive the day." I said, "Listen, that's my job. If protecting you and protecting the leader is my job in the party, and so I will do whatever I need to do to keep you in place." And we did that at the time. You'll remember. So that's element one of it, right? You have to keep your stalwarts, your base, your strongest people around you, and they have to be your enforcers in the wider party. I agree with you, by the way. If and when, and we can rewind to this, in 5 years' time, if and when Reform take power, you'll get defections back to the Tory party almost immediately. There will have been people who just ran on a Reform Party ticket to get themselves in the Commons or to keep their seats or whatever it is, and they will defect back. That we already kind of expect. The way, by the way, that the public and that the Reform voting base or the Reform activist base can ameliorate that the best and the most is by running themselves, right? If you feel like there is a chance in your neighborhood, in your community, in your constituency, where there's some Tory who's going to fly under the Reform banner just to get into power, then it is your job at a local level to block and tackle. That is not necessarily... Listen, the criticism... I was once a member of the Tory party. The criticism we had with the Tory party was that they got rid of local democracy, that every candidate was chosen by central office, that every list was created by Cameron and his cronies. And so at a grassroots level, the Reform base has as much to do with keeping the party honest as the party leadership does. That's how it should operate. That's how the party system in the United Kingdom used to operate until big corporate money started coming into everything. Big corporate money, big union money. Those are the two parties now, right? So, I think, and I'm biased, right? I know that. I'm biased because I worked with, in close proximity to the man every day for years and years. We've traveled all across the country. We've traveled all across the world. I've been to many places across the United States. I've been to Australia. I've been to all across Europe and, of course, all across the UK with Nigel Farage. I've seen what he's like in all these different scenarios. He's not going to be a pushover. And all those skeptics out there who go, yes, but this one MP, yes, but this mayoral thing. By all means, keep them honest. I'm not saying forget about it. What I'm saying to you is you have to have an element of trust in your leader, and you have to support that leader enough that he feels competent to provide leadership and not followership.
And what would your advice be regarding somebody like Robert Jenrick, who is obviously still in campaign mode as leader, trying to be leader of the Conservative Party? And I think it's a fair conclusion to draw that if he's unsuccessful in becoming leader of the Conservative Party, he may well actually look to try and defect or join Reform. I suspect that will be next on his list. What would your advice be regarding Jenrick?
I can't claim to have thought all that much about Robert Jenrick. Recently, I remember when Robert Jenrick first came to Parliament. I remember at the time his nickname, even inside, I used to run around in all these Tory circles in Westminster. Even at the time, his nickname was Robert Generic. That was sort of just cookie cutter Tory liberal politician. I understand that in recent months he's tried to shift to the right, but I think people are smart enough to see through things like that. On the one hand, you've got somebody who's been fighting this fight since the early 90s and really never changed his views and really never changed his approach. On the other hand, you've got a sort of recent Cameroon style, very slick, very highly produced politician type who has actively sought to change only, by the way, only when they lost power. My thought whenever I talk to Tory MPs who are critical, we have some Tory MPs in town last week, and I got the chance to sit down to dinner with them and have a conversation with them. My thing is always, where were you for the last 14 years? You can throw all the mud that you want nowadays, but you had so many opportunities, not just to right the wrongs of this country, but to stop more wrongs from happening. And guess what? You didn't do either of those things. You actually made things worse. You actually increased mass migration. Matt, you will remember the old UKIP escalator poster that caused so much consternation back in the day. It was an escalator on the White Cliffs of Dover, and it was Tories have increased migration, blah blah blah. And then in 2015, when we ran again, we were sitting in the office late one night, and I said, well, hold on, why don't we just put 3 escalators up the White Cliffs of Dover, because it's tripled since they took power. That's the Tory party. That's who they are. Yeah. That's who they'll revert to be.
But you have to have 7 today.
Yeah, right, exactly. Listen, unless you get corporate money out of politics, then the Tory party has no instinct to change like that. That's the people who are underwriting that party want and need mass migration. It's cheap migrant labor. That's what their businesses are built off, and it will never change. No matter what they go out in the town centers and they do their fun little walk around videos telling you this, that, and action shot and star wipe and all of this. Listen, they are still beholden to the same donor class.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I've often made the argument to young, intelligent, ambitious people in Westminster who are investing a lot in, the last-ditch attempt to save the Tories, saying, guys, path dependency matters in politics. From where you start determines your outcome. And the Tories, because they're now, coming from this position of the Boris wave, mass uncontrolled immigration, losing control of the borders, they have nowhere to go now over the next 10, 20 years. I mean, it is personified in Jenrick himself, who, this week has joined migrant protests on the ground. We've got migrant protests against the asylum hotels taking place across the country now, alongside a Raising the Flag campaign, so-called Raising the Colours campaign, where people are spontaneously putting up Union Jack and St George's flags because they've had enough. And Jenrick has tried to capitalise on that. But of course, Jenrick was the guy who expanded the use of migrant hotels when he was in office. And there has just generally been a consistent lack of understanding as to how done with the Tory party voters really are. I mean, they are done. Like, it's over. The classic book I read in university was The Strange Death of Liberal England, which of course set the stage for the rise of the Labour Party. We are genuinely living through the strange death of the Tory party, except it's not that strange. This was a party that turned on the taps. They turned on the taps. Boris basically threw this country under the bus. And this is why I genuinely believe, I really do, Nigel will become Prime Minister, not because people love Nigel. There's a 10 to 15% who really do. But I think he will become Prime Minister because he is the only alternative to the Uniparty, to the mess, to the mass migration, to the broken borders, to the two-tier justice, to the broken model of multiculturalism, to a system that, tells a young schoolgirl she turns up at school in a Union Jack dress on Culture Day that actually that's not appropriate. He will win because he is simply the only alternative. Now, that gives him an enormous sense of power, but it also, I think, goes to show how risky this is for Farage because, Starmer had the same thing, right? Starmer came in because people were just fed up of 14 years of Tory government, and I think we can all relate to that. And they put Starmer in. But look at how quickly the honeymoon phase collapsed. In fact, there was no honeymoon phase. He just went from walking into number 10 to being widely despised. Farage faces the same risk in that people are going to say, okay, you have the keys. We'll give this guy a go. You see what you can do. He'll go in day one. He has to get this right. Because it leads to the question I wanted to ask you, which is, we are assuming through this conversation that Trump 2 will be more illustrative for reform than Trump 1. And I think, I agree with your assessment, actually, of for Farage. I think he is a lot smarter than people give him credit for, and he will put together a good team. But let's assume it's not that. Let's assume it does become Trump 1 and the thing unravels. Question I want to ask you is what on earth happens to British politics then? Because this is the question that I think is hanging over everything that nobody wants to ask, which is if the people take a punt on a radical alternative, and it turns out it's not that radical, or indeed it's not that successful, then what comes after that?
Yeah.
Do we get mass apathy? Everyone just says, you know what, forget it. I'm done. It's over.
Yeah.
I'm not going to participate in politics anymore. Or do we get something that's even more radical?
It depends. I still remember screaming at whoever I could scream at in Trump 1 about certain personnel choices they were making, about certain policy things that they were missing. I mean, when Bannon was in the West Wing, I was in there just about every week, and he had this huge whiteboard on the wall of lots of different policy accomplishments that they had promised over the course of the campaign. And he was trying to keep the administration honest. And they got through a certain amount of them, but then it just stopped. It came to a complete rolling halt because of the Russia hoax, because of the impeachments, and then because of COVID. And so it depends on what potentially stymies a reform government, because people were still very sympathetic to Trump after he had left office. The MAGA base did not fall out of love with him. There were some dark moments during the Biden years where people genuinely wondered whether Trump could make a comeback. And I was at his announcement when he was running a second time, and there was some consternation in the room about the speech. Oh, it was low energy, it was waffling, he went on too long, he didn't really...
Well, we had the DeSantis thing. We had the Ron DeSantis thing too.
Yeah, and so it really depends on what potentially gets in their way. If they trip themselves up, nobody's going to forgive them. And after that comes all levels of political nihilism in the UK. And political nihilism can come with total voter apathy and turning their backs on everything political in their lives, and just living through hedonism and forgetting about all of it. Or it can come through something far, far more dangerous. It can come through, rolling street battles. It can come through mass violence. All of these things. And look, I wrote the book, Enoch Was Right, and I named it that for a reason, because I wanted people to go, oh my God, how could he possibly say something like that? Let me read it. And of course, nowadays, back when I published it, I was, pilloried about it. Nowadays, even liberal reporters come up to me and they go, well... he sort of was,
Well,
and envisioning a world that Enoch envisaged is truly terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that has struck me over the last few months, which again speaks to where we might be heading, is just the amount of civil disobedience and civil unrest that is going on in this country. We had a piece recently. It got a lot of readers where I made the argument that actually it is the Labour government that is pushing people into civil unrest, because it is treating people with, not just thinly disguised contempt, but open contempt. And I've argued now for a long time that mass uncontrolled immigration is going to be the issue that will completely reshape British politics, because nobody voted for it, nobody wants it, and it will be a disaster. Even government bodies are now openly admitting this thing is making us poorer, before you get to all the crime stats, all the social cohesion breakdown, all of the things that the state is desperately trying to hide from people. We've been running a transparency campaign, submitting FOIs and so on in the UK. And it is just amazing the extent to which the state simultaneously says, well, you're misinformed if you care about this, but P.S., we're not going to give you the information that you need to make an assessment about this. It is unbelievable hypocrisy. And I think one thing a reform government could do that would be very powerful, I think, is just pull back the curtain. Just tell people what's going on. Just say, day one, I'm ordering all government departments to release all of this information. Get it out there. Let people make up their own minds, right? We're going to pull back the curtain and we're going to show you the emperor is, not wearing any clothes. This whole thing has been hidden from you. And I think that's one thing that could happen early on. But also this, this radical counter-revolution, which is exactly what it's going to have to be. There's going to have to be a plan for leaving the European Convention on Human Rights very early on. There's going to have to be a plan for repealing the Human Rights Act. There's going to have to be a plan for basically taking us back to the pre-Blairite revolution, a factory reset in this country, which is going to be messy constitutionally, but absolutely essential. And this is where conservatives really lacked courage. For 14 years, they embraced that Blairite legacy. And I think, obviously, with Farage, you have an opportunity now to actually have a government that is going to finally take that on. And if he does that, I think he'll win a lot of plaudits from among conservatives too, who will say, we should have done this.
Well, let me add to that. There's got to be a plan that puts Britain back in its rightful place in NATO and the United Nations. And if they don't want to give us, the requisite per how much we put in and how much they rely on Britain, then we have to renegotiate our membership or look at it entirely again, right? And that was what Trump's whole thing was at the beginning as well. It's like, hey, these institutions, they work, but they don't quite work for us in the way that they should. And they don't quite work for the British taxpayer currently in the way that they should. There's got to be a renegotiation of lots of different things. One of the things I think, and by the way, culturally, we have to think about it as well. Culturally, it's easy now to say that post-imperial, white, liberal guilt is over. It's not cool. It was never cool, but it's over and it's cringe. And to lean into that as well is going to be a major, major part of all of this. It'll be a major part of governing, quite frankly. It's coming from that basis. But there's two major places that are going to really, really characterize not just a government, but the potential rise to government. Number one is obviously immigration, mass migration, deportations, repatriations, whatever you want to call them. There has to be a plan in place for those things. But number two, if you look at the data, is the NHS. Reform voters even are skeptical of where reform stands on the NHS. And it is the weakest possible point. It was our weakest point in 2015. We felt it over and over again, is that fundamentally people didn't trust us on the NHS. And the opposition kept lying about Nigel Farage's views on the NHS, and those lies permeated. So he has to also take that fight to that level to say, hey, for too long, Matt, the British public have been convinced that the NHS is the patient rather than that they're the patient. And actually taking actual reform to the NHS and making sure that it has deliverables like affordable medicines, like affordable pharmaceutical products that can land in people's laps and they can live healthier lifestyles is a major, major issue for people. In an older country, an older population, the NHS isn't serving people as it should anymore, and it needs a whole fresh look.
I think that is one of the arguments that has to be broken open at some point. You just simply need to say to the British people, you're spending 200 odd billion here on a health service, a social care system, neither of which are working. We have to just be very direct and straight with people. To go back to your earlier point, sometimes public opinion isn't right. And even though people say, we love the NHS, it's great, you have to ask them, is this actually working? Same with the welfare state, by the way. I mean, if you want to end mass migration, you also simultaneously have to fix welfare. We cannot have 10 million working age adults on welfare, including 1 million young people not in education, employment and work. That is crazy. And we also, by the way, I think, need to be frank and honest, brutally honest with people about debt. We have an enormous pile of debt, and we are spending £16 billion a month just servicing the interest on that debt. It's completely insane. I actually think Farage needs to stand outside number 10 and just be straight with people and say, you know what? We are basically bankrupt. We really don't have much money at all. Our credit card, we have a credit card to service our existing credit card, is completely out of control. Somebody needs to actually call time on this. Somebody needs to restore stability, some fiscal confidence. Somebody needs to actually start, running this country as it should be run, because what's happened over the preceding 50 years is completely bananas. He has to be honest with people about the scale of the problem. So I completely agree with you on all of that. I guess going back just briefly as we come towards a close, the point about the plan. So Trump got into problems with, the Heritage 2025 project. There was a big media debate about, oh my God, look at what they're planning to do, but yada, yada, yada. I know there is a lot of work happening in Westminster at the moment. I know a lot of good friends of mine are working on it, preparing pieces of legislation, plans, and programs. I mean, what would your advice be around getting that into place? Because I would be suggesting that, look, where are we now? We're coming up to the end of 25. I would say we've got 2 years max. My gut instinct is Labour's going to go for an early election in March, April 28. Fiscal environment's going to collapse, probably going to have some external intervention, maybe the IMF. I think Rachel Reeves will get dumped. I think Starmer may end up going, and I think we'll end up possibly with some sort of Angela Rayner, Wes Street in kind of scenario. Labour will never relinquish power, so they'll never vote themselves out of power. So let's say they go for an earlier election. That leaves 2 years for reform to get a programme of government in place, a timetable, a plan, all of that stuff. How does Farage even go about doing that and putting that together?
Yeah, I have talked about it for a long time, actually. And just to come back on one of the things you said, I think it's very important as well. Talking about the NHS, is that people are convinced that the NHS is, the health service is either a socialised healthcare system like the UK or a corporatized system like the US. And that, don't be sold on that false dichotomy is my point to people. Because listen, I've lived under both now. Nobody has to tell me how terrible it is. I mean, I'm at the dentist again later on this week. How terrible it is to go there and get hit with a bill for $4,000. Believe me, there's going to be a threading of the needle here. That people need to realise that the NHS as it currently stands is no longer serving the British public. It is being served by the British public, and that is not how it was ever meant to be. In terms of putting plans in place, I've said for a long time that really, they need a think tank or multiple think tanks. And I know that sort of some plans have been happening and some think tanks are a little bit more reform friendly now and things like that. But, to have everything just emanating out of the party itself is a bad idea, because then you're going to get dinged on it. Necessarily things will leak. Necessarily things will be couched in incorrect terms. The fake news media and the Guardians and the Mirrors of the world will necessarily, like they did with Project 2025 and Trump, try to demonize a lot of the policies that are, just being knocked about. You have to understand that when a party's putting a manifesto together, it will knock about all kinds of ideas. It will knock about ideas that you might think are crazy. It will knock about ideas that you might think are too weak and woolly. That's the policy making process. And so you can't really keep a lid on these things. So the way to deal with it is actually to farm a lot of that stuff out to third parties, to working groups, to committees, and actually encourage public engagement with all of those things. One of the things that we have in this town last week, we had the Great American Farmers Market. And what we did, my colleague and I, Bart, he's our chef over at Butterworth, we went to the market, we took the farmers to the restaurant afterwards, and we heard from them what is actually going on. Why is this costing you so much? What are these parasites you're dealing with? How is the government non-responsive? Why aren't you getting the bang for your buck? All of these sort of things that actually public consultation and things like that are going to be paramount to putting together a real populist manifesto.
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear that. I know people underestimate publicly in the UK the amount of work that is going on. I'm frustrated when I hear people say, "Oh, there's no plan," because actually I know a lot of people that are well advanced into putting that plan together and that legislation. Raheem Kassam, it's been great to talk with you straight from Capitol Hill, Washington. We've mentioned your books, No-Go Zones, the provocatively titled Enoch Was Right, but also Butterworth, where you're co-owner, and of course National Pulse, and everybody can find Raheem online. As always, we want to bring you voices that are connected, that have been at the very heart of the things that we write about and the things that we talk about. So thank you for reading, subscribing, and supporting as always, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you very much.